Welcome to Radiant Midweek. Here we go. Hey, welcome to Radiant Midweek, and I'm coming at you this week from my basement. Where I live, we got about 20 plus inches of snow. The roads are still kind of dangerous out there, and we're sitting at 10 below. It's cold, and we're staying off the roads as much as possible. I'll rejoin you in the podcast room next week, but I didn't want to miss out on putting out one this week, and so let's dive in. In 1978, a group of people moved to Guyana in what is now known as the Jonestown Massacre. They were following a leader named Jim Jones, and ultimately what happened is 918 members of the People's Temple ended up committing suicide or forcibly murdered others in what looked like an apparent suicide, including a great number of children. This leader, Jim Jones, proclaimed himself to be the Messiah, and the people were following him, believing him to be the Messiah of the People's Temple, only to come to their doom. It's not the first time we've seen someone claim to be a Messiah and bad things happen alongside it. Maybe you're old enough to remember the Branch Davidian. In 1981, there was a young man named Vernon Howell, and he came to an area called New Mount Carmel. Later, he would change his name to David Koresh, and that's probably the name that might be setting off alarms in your head. He went there to study biblical prophecy, but later, around 1987, Koresh and some of his followers that he'd been accumulating went back to the Mount Carmel Center, and they engaged in a shootout with the leaders and took over the compound by force. David Koresh saw himself as the seventh and final Messiah. Not 100% sure what that means, but his persona consisted of the reincarnations of the previous six, one of which included Jesus. 1993, February, suspecting that this group of people hanging out with David Koresh were stockpiling illegal weapons, the ATF obtained a search warrant for the compound, and they also got some arrest warrants to take some of them in. However, the group that was there somehow found out that the ATF was coming, and when they arrived, they were fully armed and prepared. And unfortunately, what happened after that was an intense gunfight, and it resulted in the death of 4 ATF agents and 6 Branch Davidians. And then this also ended up, if you're old enough to remember, this several month-long standoff occurred until April 19th, 1993, the FBI then launched a tear gas attack and invaded the compound. However, many of us watching the television at the time have vivid memories of the compound being engulfed in flames, and when it was all over, it resulted in the death of 76 Branch Davidians. This included 25 children, 2 pregnant women, and David Koresh, the leader himself. It was a tragic, tragic event. Just last week, reading in Fox News, I saw an article, and you can see it there online. A polygamous cult leader's daughter breaks free and says that the false prophet abused her, and the world could see the shame. And once again, we have another false prophet, another Messiah out there leading people down roads they don't need to go down and deceiving them. There have been an enormous amount of people, unfortunately, in the last 2,000 years that have claimed to be the Messiah or false prophets. I've put some of them on the screen there for you to see. I was actually quite surprised at the number. And so as we pick back up in our study of Matthew 24, the disciples had 3 specific questions for Jesus. They may not have realized they were asking 3, but Jesus would treat them as 3 questions. They would ask, when will these things happen? What will be the sign of your coming and the sign of the end of the age? And Jesus begins answering their questions pretty interestingly, maybe not the way we would expect. Let's notice here in Matthew 24, starting in verse 4, he says, "Watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name claiming, 'I am the Messiah.'" And notice this last part here, so important, "and they will deceive many." Now, isn't it interesting that the first thing Jesus does is answer their questions by warning them about being deceived? And we need to pay attention to that too. In fact, within 100 years, Israel would see a false Messiah that would lead them down roads they wished they hadn't. It would be the third time that Israel would rebel against Rome. It's called the Bar Kokhba Revolt, and it was around 132 AD. Like I said, the third major Jewish clash with the Romans. And just like the second one, hundreds of thousands of people would lose their lives. When the smoke cleared, nearly 580,000 Jewish citizens and rebels were killed. After that, the Jews, in fact, were barred from going into Jerusalem. In fact, it wasn't even called Jerusalem after that. Rome did everything they could do to get the Jewish population out of this area so that these attacks would no longer happen. It was led by a man named Simon Bar Kokhba, and he was the leader of the revolt. He was regarded as the Jewish Messiah of Judaism, and the Talmud, however, refers to him as the son of deception, which is a derogatory term that he's a false Messiah. However, this one person claiming to be the Messiah led hundreds of thousands of people to their death. And so since Jesus mentions this deception first, it's obviously very important to him, so we need to pay attention to this, and we're going to dive into this a little bit today because it will come up in other passages as well. The Apostle Peter, the Apostle Paul both talk about this. Even John hints at it in his letters, and then we will see also some of this in the book of Revelation. So this is an important understanding that at the end times there will be some false teachers, some false messiahs, and even here in a minute we'll see false prophets. And so three key areas, though, as we dive in that Jesus wants us to know. First off, many will come in his name. And I showed you that list there from online. There was, in the last 2,000 years, there's been quite a few. They will claim to be the Messiah, and they will deceive many. He would go on to warn them several times in this chapter. When we go to verse 11 of Matthew 24, he says, "And many false prophets will appear and deceive many people." In verse 23, he says, "At that time, if anyone says to you, 'Look, here is the Messiah,' or 'There he is,' do not believe it." Why? False messiahs and false prophets will appear to perform great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. In verse 26, he continues, he says, "If anyone tells you, 'There he is,' out in the wilderness," talking about false prophet or a false messiah, "don't go out." Or, "Here he is in the inner rooms," don't believe it. And so there are two specific characters I want to look at today and one specific result of those two characters. And so who are those two primary characters? Well, the first we could see was there are false messiahs, and the second are false prophets. And I just want to interject something here because I study end times and read a lot of authors and podcasts and so forth. And a lot of time and attention is given to the false Messiah, or someone that many refer to as the antichrist. I do not see is much discussion about false prophet. And we need to understand these are two very separate characters. We're going to discuss that in a minute. And we need to be looking for both. Several of the authors, including Jesus, warn us, be aware, be on your guard. So it's not just an antichrist we're looking for out there. It's a false prophet as well, who will deceive by signs and wonders. That's somebody we really should be learning and paying attention to as well. And what's the result of false prophets and false messiahs? Number three will be false teaching. We need to be aware of false teaching. And one other thing, kind of a caveat here, I use the word antichrist here because it comes up a lot in end times literature and so forth. But notice Jesus at no time uses the word antichrist. None of the other authors except John use the word antichrist, and that's only in his letters that he sends out to churches and people. It's not mentioned in the book of Revelation. It's just a term, though, that we have used a lot to describe this end times beast, this end times Messiah, world ruler, whoever it may be. But at times I'm going to abandon the word antichrist because I think it's gotten muddied up a little bit and it's confusing. Let's use some of the words that the Bible uses to describe these people. Because in Revelation, he's called a false Messiah. He's called a beast. He demands worship. And then also in Revelation, as I noticed, there's a false prophet. And I don't want us to just kind of lump both of them in as antichrist. They're two very separate people. The false prophet points to the false Messiah, uses signs and wonders. And so we can get so focused on the antichrist narrative, we can lose sight of the false prophet and this very, very important character in the end times narrative. Jesus is warning us to be aware of both. Both have a part to play, and Revelation is going to break that down even further. So a little bit of a spoiler alert since we haven't gotten into Revelation yet, but both the false prophet and the false Messiah get thrown into the pit at the end of the story. We see in Revelation 19, verse 20, it says, "But the beast was captured, and with it the false prophet who had performed signs on his behalf. And with these signs, what happened? He had deluded those who had received the mark of the beast and worshipped its image. The two of them were thrown alive in the fiery lake of burning sulfur." So we have a false prophet, we have a false Messiah, and the result of both is false teaching. Let's dive into each of these for just a moment. Let's talk first about the false Messiah. And what's a false Messiah? It's someone who claims to be the messianic figure, a God, or even Jesus. And again, I'm showing you that look of all the false, or that page with all the false messiahs or people who have claimed to be the Messiah throughout history. It's numerous, and we even know some modern ones, such we talked about David Koresh, Sun Myung Moon of the Unification Church, and there's many more. You might be curious to know that there's some in Judaism who claim that the Messiah is here, that he meets the modern day criteria for the long expected Messiah. His name is Rav Shlomo Yehuda. He's 34 years old, Jewish man. He's a rabbi. And he's kind of a prodigy of sorts. He's a very smart person. He has much, if not all, of the Jewish Bible, that's kind of the Old Testament, memorized. And reports are circulating that he has performed at least 5 miracles. What are some other names for this false Messiah? Well, Paul calls him the man of lawlessness. We see this in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. He says, "Don't let anyone deceive you in any way, for that day will not come until the rebellion occurs, apostasy, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the man doomed to destruction. He will oppose and will exalt himself over everything that is called God or is worshipped, so that he sets himself up in God's temple, proclaiming himself to be God." And so notice a similar warning here from Paul that Jesus gave us, and it resonates through the New Testament. Don't be deceived. This implies that some will be deceived, and we need to pay attention then to what's being said here. It also talks about that there's a rebellion or there's an apostasy, and we're going to tear into that in another podcast, maybe not the next one, but the one after that, because I think this is something we need to dive into further and learn more about. But the warning is clear. At the end of times, there will be apostasy within the church, and some of that will be because people are deceived. 1 Timothy chapter 4 says, the Spirit clearly says that in later times, some will abandon the faith and follow deceiving spirits and things taught by demons. Such teachings come through hypocritical liars whose consciences have been seared with a hot iron. And so at the end, there is this lawless man. He will place himself above God. He will demand worship. Somehow he sets himself up, whether that's a statue, an image, or something in the temple. He will proclaim himself to be God and demand people bow down and worship him. This appears in Matthew 24 as well. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, he continues, he says, "The lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord Jesus Christ will overthrow with the breath of his mouth and destroy by the splendor of his coming." The coming of the lawless one will be in accordance with how Satan works. So how does Satan work? He will use all sorts of displays of power through signs and wonders that serve the lie, in all the ways that wickedness deceives those who are perishing. They perish because they refuse to love the truth and so be saved. So we do know that this person will be destroyed when Jesus arrives, and that's great news. That is something we have to look forward to. But before that happens, he causes an enormous amount of trouble. However, he also wants us to know that many people will be deceived. And so please pay attention to this. Jesus is warning his disciples. He'd be warning us too because we are disciples. And what are Satan's tools? Well, he noticed that there's earthly power, military, political, economic, and just controlling the populace. That there will be signs and wonders. And it's funny, when Jesus was asked for a sign, he would tell a group of people in Matthew 16, verse 4, he says, "A wicked and adulterous generation looks for a sign, but none will be given it except the sign of Jonah." And so these signs and wonders that the false prophet and the Antichrist will be doing will back up the lie so that it appears to be true. Therefore, these are truly convincing lies, and we need to pay attention to them. And then he mentions that all the ways that wickedness deceives those who are perishing. And it's basically saying wicked, self-righteous living. All the ways the Bible constantly warns us about that are earthly, that are sensual, that are not part of the creative order, whether that's sexual immorality, whether that's greed, whether that's power, whether that's addiction. All of those things are missing the mark and outside of God's plans for our lives, and therefore they are wicked and they are evil. And yet we live in a world that champions many of these things. And for a lot of people, the lure of money and sexual immorality or the trap of addictions, these things look good at first, but at the end they will deceive us and they will destroy us. The Bible says there is a way that seems right to man, but leads to death. And so our natural tendency in our human earthly nature is to try to satisfy the flesh. If it looks good, sounds good, feels good, tastes good, it must be good. But we are called constantly in the New Testament to live by the Spirit because our bodies are the temple for God. His Spirit resides in us and lives through us in all that we do. We are citizens, ambassadors of the kingdom. We are lights in our community, and when others see us, they are to see the power of Jesus Christ manifesting itself in and through us in everything we do. But there are a number of things pulling us away from kingdom living, and we can name the big three right now: sex, money, power. Do you struggle with any of these things? Another word for the lawless one is antichrist. However, again, not a word used by Jesus. Revelation doesn't talk about it. It's only in 1st and 2nd John that we see this word. So let's take a look at it real quick. And probably an important note, though, John, who wrote 1st and 2nd John, is the same John of the book of Revelation. So there's a tie-in there that doesn't make Antichrist completely invalid. The word just isn't used in Revelation ever. But in 1 John chapter 2, it says, "Dear children, this is the last hour, and you have heard that the Antichrist is coming. Even now, many Antichrists have come. And this is how we know it's the last hour. They went out from us, but they didn't really belong to us. For if they had belonged to us, they would have remained with us. But their going showed that none of them belonged to us. But you have an anointing from the Holy One, and all of you know the truth. I do not write to you because you do not know the truth, but because you do know it, and because no lie comes from the truth. Who is the liar? This is important. Pay attention to this. Whoever denies that Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah, such a person is the Antichrist, denying the Father and the Son, the Trinity there. So what he says here is many Antichrists have come. Again, John points to the reality of apostasy or rebellion or a falling away later on, that they went out from us, they didn't belong to us, that there are people in the church that can be pretenders but aren't really disciples. They can be spectators but not be fully surrendered, attenders but bearing no fruit. Religious but lacking in relationship. Each of those things are not part of what it means to be a genuine follower of Jesus Christ. And so Jesus is going to talk about apostasy more and more in Matthew 24. And again, like I said, we'll get to that in another podcast. But he says they don't belong to us. Although they claim to be Christians, they were never truly citizens, ambassadors, and representatives of the kingdom. And that's why I remind us time and time again, did you know you can attend church, you can mark it off your list each week, take the right classes, try to be a good person, and still be far from Jesus Christ? Because there is a difference between religion and relationship. Jesus would tell a group of people, "Depart from me, I never knew you." It had to do with relationship, not what they were doing. And so who are the liars? This is so important we pay attention to this, particularly in our world and how I believe the end times is beginning to unfold in front of us. It's whoever denies that Jesus is the Christ, that he is the Messiah from the line of David, King of Israel, and ruler of the world. Anyone who denies that is part of the antichrist movement. And they also deny the Father and the Son. And what he means by that is Jesus made very bold claims. And he would say that I am the great I am. He would say that the Father and I are one. He would claim to be the same as God. And the first chapter of John definitely says that he is God in the flesh, incarnate. God and Jesus are one. So important that we grasp that, and that is not an area of our faith we can compromise or bend upon. The second time we see Antichrist is in 2 John 7, and he said, I say this because many deceivers who do not acknowledge Jesus Christ as coming in the flesh have gone out into the world, and such is the deceiver and the Antichrist. And yes, there's a piece of this that is pointing to the Gnostic beliefs that would be repudiated more and more by the church in the coming centuries, that Jesus was not actually mortal, that he was some sort of spiritual being. We don't have time to dive into all of that today. However, this was prevalent in John's time. But notice again, though, he did use the title Christ, which in the Greek means Messiah. It means the anointed ones, set apart by God, sent by God's purpose. And so the Antichrist denies that Jesus is the Messiah and that he is not God in the flesh. Anything that would teach that out there is part of the Antichrist movement, and we do not entertain that. We do not believe that. These are core to what we believe as Christians, and you've got to know that. The book of Revelation calls him a beast. I'm going to look at Revelation 13 here, but we're going to skip some verses because we'll be diving into this more later on. But in Revelation chapter 13, it says, I saw a beast coming out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads with 10 crowns on its horns, and on each head a blasphemous name. And people worshipped the dragon because he had given authority to the beast, and they also worshipped the beast and asked, who is like the beast? Who can wage war against it? And it was given power to wage war against God's holy people. That's important. And to conquer them. And it was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. All the inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast. Now notice, people worship this beast. It mentions it twice in just this small passage of Revelation 13. And so it's important to note, though, as we talk more about the beast, that the beast can represent not only a person, but it can represent an empire. Revelation uses these interchangeably, and that's not unusual. When we think of the ancient Greek empire, although it went on for hundreds of years, we often associate it with Alexander the Great. When we think of 100 years ago that there was a German man with a funny mustache in World War II, we often associate him with the party he represented. Putin represents Russia in many ways when we talk about that Xi, the president of the People's Republic of China. So oftentimes the person and the empire are used the same interchangeably, both representing the beast. This beast that they're talking about in Revelation 13 has enormous military power. And it's important to note, who is God's people it mentions here? Well, I will just tell you, it's the Christians in this passage. Jesus, again, is speaking to his disciples as followers of Jesus Christ. He's not talking to the Jewish nation right here. He's talking to Christians, which means they're on earth at this time, and that the dragon, which is Satan, has targeted them for destruction. So please pay attention to this. They are conquered. This person, this beast, this false Messiah, has power over the entire world. Let's look at the next character now, the false prophets. Now, we've been warned before by Jesus. In Matthew chapter 7, verse 15, he says, watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. Now, real quick, what is the meaning of the word prophet? Well, the word prophet comes from the Hebrew word nabi. It means to bubble forth like a fountain, to utter, to speak, or to pour forth an announcement. In other words, or other words that are used for this are hoseh or roeh. Both mean seer. And so the terms all put together mean and imply that it's a person who is receiving an announcement directly from God, that vision then bubbles forth for others to receive too. What is the purpose of prophets in the Bible? A prophet is meant to receive a message from God, and these can be verbal directives or visions or dreams. They communicate that message to the people. And it's important to note that God often sent prophets to warn or guide his people. And so they serve as representatives, ambassadors, spokespeople of the kingdom. Israel's kings would often seek the counsel of prophets before making major decisions because they wanted to make sure that their actions were in line with what God had in store for the nation of Israel. So prophets were very important throughout the Bible. But here we're talking about a false prophet. And what is a false prophet? Well, they assume to have a direct connection to God. They speak using his authority. They'll say, I am speaking for God, but yet they operate from their own agendas. Jeremiah 23 says, this is what the Lord Almighty says, do not listen to what the prophets are prophesying to you. They will fill you with false hopes. In other words, there were false prophets during this time of Jeremiah as well. They speak visions from their own minds and not from the mouth of the Lord. And these false prophets often will just claim to have new revelations from God that contradict what the revealed scripture has to say. This is how you can tell if you've got a false prophet on your hand. And that's why the Bible has to be the standard in your life. Muhammad is one of those. He wrote the Quran. He believed that the Old Testament and the New Testament had been falsified. And the purpose was to correct the false Christian and Jewish community's beliefs from their misunderstandings about Jesus and the Old Testament narrative and the hope of God. They believe, for instance, Ishmael is God's chosen seed, not Isaac. That he was a prophet and a messenger of God. That there's a direct link between him and Muhammad. In fact, it's said that he is who built the Kaaba, which is, many of you have seen pictures of this before. Millions of people walk around this every year. Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism, was given various visions to help us reinterpret the Bible, to even supplement the Bible with their own Book of Mormon, because we have misunderstandings from the teachings of Jesus that over the course of, at this point, about 1,800 years, distortions had slipped in. And so this was to correct those distortions and get us back to the original beliefs. But yet he claims that this is an entirely new, discovered revelation about some people that visited the Americas from Judah many, many years ago, and that this book supersedes and corrects the Bible. The point here, and that's just a couple that we're looking at, is to beware that those who come and they claim that they have new revelations from God that contradict what the scriptures have to say, especially when they're beginning to foretell the future and what they believe the vision of that looks like. In Revelation, a second beast appears. And briefly, again, we'll look at that today. Revelation 13, it says, Then I saw a second beast coming out of the earth. It had 2 horns like a lamb, but it spoke like a dragon. It exercised all the authority of the first beast on its behalf, and it made the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose fatal wound had been healed. And it performed great signs, even causing fire to come down from heaven to the earth in full view of the people, much like Elijah did in the Old Testament. Because of the signs it was given power to perform on behalf of the first beast. Notice what it says here. Don't miss this. It deceived the inhabitants of the earth. And so here, even in Revelation, we end up seeing there's 2 characters, just like Matthew 24. These 2 books align. There is a false Messiah and there is a false prophet. We need to be looking for both. Now, what's the result of false messiahs and false prophets? False teaching and false teachers out there. A professor and theologian out there, Renald Showers, he had this to say. He said, years ago, a seminary professor told his class in the beginning of the semester that they would work together on a major project during that semester. That they'd move systematically through the New Testament to categorize every area of truth and determine how many times each area is addressed. Their goal was to find what one thing is emphasized more than any other in the New Testament. And when they completed the project, they were amazed to see that the warning against false doctrine is emphasized more than any other thing, even more than love, unity, and experience. Did you catch that? The authors of the New Testament spent more time talking about false teachers and looking out for false prophets and false messiahs than any other subject matter. It's important, and we need to be on our guard. And so I told you we were going to look at 2 Peter chapter 2 just a minute. In verse 1 he says, "But there were also false prophets among the teacher, just as there will be false teachers." Curious right here, by the way, he separates these two out as well. False prophets, false teachers. "They will secretly introduce destructive heresies, even denying the sovereign Lord who bought them, bringing swift destruction to themselves." So you can see there a list of 22 things. I'm not going to go through it all here. I encourage you to go back later and look at it, of describing what these false teachers are like, that they'll infiltrate the church, they work in secret, but they deny the work of Jesus Christ. They blaspheme the truth. Here's the key one. They're greedy. And how many false teachers do we know out there that are just in it for the money? They need another airplane, or they just need you to give a little more, pay it forward, whatever it may be. And this is blasphemy. They use words, he says, that are remarkably close to the truth, but yet they're living in the flesh. They're presumptuous, they're self-willed, and they do not also come under anyone's authority. Be cautious of any church where the lead pastor, is the only person in charge. Everybody needs to have a group of people around them holding them accountable. And they look peaceful, but they speak more evil than good. Really, they're ignorant. And I'm not going to go into this. I do point out number 14, though, they're full of adultery. And how many pastors have we watched in just the past few years, big church famous pastors who have fallen because of poor decisions concerning sexual immorality, adultery, pornography, whatever it may be. These are all signs of an apostate church. And so what's the important point here? Jesus is warning the disciple that there are false prophets and messiahs coming. And again, he's talking to the disciples. He's warning the church. At no point does he say, hey, don't worry about it. Christians aren't going to be around for this anyways. And I realize this might confront your end times interpretation, but we have to be able to push at some narratives out there, because for many, they've just assumed it's true without understanding there's many other viewpoints out there as well. I realize this might confront some famous books and series and movies, famous TV pastors out there and so forth. I'm not saying I'm smarter than them. What I am saying is let's just pay attention to what the Bible's saying here. Don't add to it, and don't force a false narrative into it. As we read further in Matthew 24, we'll read about Jesus and a harvest later in the chapter where he sends out his angels. But it's not here. Here he's warning his disciples, and he wants them to warn other disciples. There is a rebellion coming. People are going to be fooled, and there is coming a persecution of the church that will be like none it's ever seen before. So pay attention and know this. When Jesus returns, it will be in the clouds with trumpets, blaring with the glory and power and his majesty. Every eye will see, the Bible says, when he comes. He won't be randomly walking around in the wilderness. He will not be hidden in a room, as we were warned in Matthew 24. No, when Jesus comes back this next time, it will be with power and glory. The whole world will see it. There will be signs in the sky. So don't be deceived when someone tells you to go out in the wilderness or go into this room. To to see a false prophet or false Messiah. And so again, the point here is do not be deceived. There are false messiahs, false prophets, and false teaching. And these false prophets and messiahs will back it up with signs and wonders. They will be convincing, and many will be deceived. 1 Timothy chapter 4 says, the Spirit clearly says that in later times some will abandon the faith and follow deceiving spirits and things taught by demons. Such teachings come through hypocritical liars whose consciences have been seared with a hot iron. So what do they teach? They teach that Jesus of Nazareth is not the Messiah, that he is not the King of Israel from the line of David who will rule the world. He is not God in the flesh. He is the Father, or him and the Father are not one. And so they will challenge, for instance, the Trinity. And somehow they will tell us we got it all wrong. We heard the original message wrong. The authors penned it wrong and just put falsities into the Bible and all sorts of other things. And that they're here to help us get the story straight. They're here to purify the message and to tell us what it originally was meant to say. And we've got to be careful that a future world ruler is coming. He will be supported by a false prophet, and they will be teaching these things. And so here's my conclusion for today. We've covered a lot of ground, and I appreciate your patience. Again, the big point of this entire thing, Jesus starts by answering their questions with, don't be fooled. In our desire to understand the future, don't miss this emphasis that Jesus makes in his opening word, because it dominates the entire Olivet discourse. This will be a time of great uncertainty. People will doubt the Jesus of the Bible. They will struggle with the meaning of the events unfolding. And by the way, all three of the synoptic gospels talk about this, whether it's here in Matthew 24, Mark 13, or Luke 21. This idea that people will be deceived is clearly a top priority of Jesus. In Luke 21, for instance, he says, see to it that no one, or that you not be misled, for many will come in my name saying, I am he, and the time is at hand. Do not go after them. Remember, the two things they'll proclaim is they'll proclaim to be the Messiah, and also that the time is at hand. This is why it's important, my dear friend, that your faith be rooted and grounded in the firm foundation of biblical truth, so that one day when that truth is challenged and it's supported with signs and wonders, things that might look convincing on the outside, that you will not be deceived because you hold firmly to the truth, that Jesus Christ is the Messiah, the anointed one sent by God, he and he alone, and that Jesus and the Father is one, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. And so I end with this last verse in Luke chapter 21 as we conclude today. Be always on the watch, Jesus said, and pray that you may be able to escape all that is about to happen, and that you may be able to stand before the Son of Man. That is my prayer too. Jesus Christ is coming back again. It will be with power and glory. So anybody who challenges that Jesus is not the Christ and that he and the Father are not one, that is the antichrist at work in the world. Do not be deceived, my friends. Hold firmly to the truth of Scripture. God bless. Thanks for letting me talk to you today. Hey, if you're enjoying this, and we're going to be talking about apostasy, and we're really getting into the fun stuff now, would you subscribe to the channel? Each of these things help get the word out further to other people. The more likes, the more subscribes, the more healthy comments that we have, the more it sends it out there to a larger audience. And I believe this is a message more and more people need to hear. So if you could help me out, I would appreciate that. Otherwise, we'll see you next week as we continue in Matthew 24. What are some of the false signs of the end? What are the things we shouldn't be looking for?